Welcome to our deep dive into a tough topic, but a really important one, slavery in America.
Yeah.
We're using excerpts from Kenneth C. Davis's An American Slavery Timeline, 1492 to 1776, from the History Reader website.
Right.
So we're focusing on this early period leading up to the Revolution.
Okay.
And get this, the first Africans who arrived in what would become the U.S., they weren't actually slaves.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah, when those 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619,
Nah.
I mean, it's often seen as the start of slavery in America.
Right.
But technically, they were indentured servants.
So what's the difference? Like, how is that different from being a slave?
Well, with indentured servitude, people would agree to work for a certain number of years
Okay.
in exchange for things like passage to the colonies or to pay off debts.
Oh, interesting.
And they were promised freedom, once their term of service was complete.
Okay.
And actually, this was pretty common for European immigrants at the time.
So these first Africans had a chance at freedom then?
Yes, but even with that possibility, they were still treated as, a source of labor.
Yeah.
Which kind of set the stage for a system where Africans were more and more seen as commodities,
Right.
not individuals with rights.
That's a scary thought. And it kind of leads us to 1662, right?
Yeah.
There's a Virginia law Davis points to as like a major turning point.
This law basically said that if a child was born to an enslaved mother, that child was also a slave.
Wow.
It didn't matter who their father was.
So before that, it wasn't clear cut.
Yeah, before that, there was some ambiguity, but this law made it very clear.
Okay.
Slavery was now hereditary, passed down from mother to child.
That changes everything.
Exactly.
It's not about an individual situation anymore. It's about their ancestry, their whole lineage.
It really solidifies the racialized system of slavery that we know.
Yeah.
Because of this law,
Yeah.
generations of black people were born into slavery.
Wow.
It created a permanent underclass with no way out.
It's just mind-boggling how one law can have such a huge impact, across generations.
It really shows how laws can be used to create and enforce systems of oppression.
So we have this system of slavery getting more and more entrenched.
Right.
But at the same time, Davis mentions people speaking out against it,
Yes.
like Judge Samuel Sewall in Boston in the early 1700s.
Sewall is a fascinating figure. He was a prominent judge,
Okay.
and he actually wrote one of the first anti-slavery pieces in America.
Really?
He argued that all people, regardless of their race, had a natural right to liberty.
Which is pretty radical for that time period.
Yes, especially considering how embedded slavery was in the colonies.
But wasn't he also involved in the Salem witch trials?
Yeah, that's the thing about this era, right?
Yeah.
It's full of contradictions. Here's this guy who can see the injustice of slavery,
Right.
but he's also caught up in the prejudices of his time.
It makes you think, how much progress can you really make?
Yeah.
If even the people advocating for change are still limited by, their society.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
It's a good question.
But even with those early critics, slavery kept growing. And Davis says the 1700s saw the African slave trade just explode
Right.
into the world's most profitable business.
It's crazy.
Why was there such a huge demand?
Well, it's all tied to the economics of the time.
Okay.
This was when cash crops like tobacco and rice were taking off in the colonies.
Right.
Those crops needed tons of labor.
Yeah.
And tragically, that labor was supplied through the transatlantic slave trade.
So it's like this horrible clash.
Right.
You have these moral arguments against slavery starting to emerge,
Yeah,
but then the economic forces are pushing for its expansion.
absolutely.
There must have been a lot of tension.
Oh, definitely. And that tension plays out in interesting ways throughout this period.
Okay.
For example, Davis talks about a ledger from 1754.
Uh-huh.
It documents the sale of 118 slaves in Charleston, South Carolina.
Wow.
It's chilling to read. It really shows how routine the slave trade had become.
Yeah, just the thought of these ledgers, people bought and sold like property. It's just
Asha.
unfathomable.
It's important to remember these ledgers represent real people
Right.
with families, histories, dreams. They were stripped of their humanity,
Yeah.
reduced to commodities, their lives controlled by whoever claimed to own them.
It's so dehumanizing.
It is.
But were there any signs of organized resistance to slavery at this point?
Yes. The Quakers were one of the first groups to actively oppose slavery.
Okay.
They believed in the equality of all people,
Right.
so they saw slavery as a sin.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you have these competing forces, the economics of slavery driving the colony's growth,
Right.
the moral arguments against it gaining traction, and the lives of so many people caught in between.
It's a volatile mix that sets the stage for the American Revolution.
Yeah, and that's where we see how deeply connected slavery was to the fight for freedom.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775, where he offers freedom to enslaved people.
Right.
If they join the British forces. So what was he thinking?
Well, Dunmore was the British governor of Virginia.
Right.
He knew that offering freedom to enslaved people would weaken the colonial forces.
Oh, I see.
And maybe even turn the tide of the war in Britain's favor.
Smart, but ruthless.
Definitely.
So how did the colonists react to this?
They were furious. Of course, they saw it as a betrayal, a threat to their way of life.
Yeah, can't imagine they were happy about that.
Not at all. But for many enslaved people, it was a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
A chance at a life they never thought possible.
That must have been such a tough decision for those who were enslaved.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you side with the British, who are offering you freedom but are also a foreign power?
Right.
Or do you stay loyal to the colonists who are fighting for their own liberty?
That's a dilemma.
But still see you as property?
There were no easy answers. And we know from historical accounts, Black people fought on both sides of the revolution.
Wow.
Each with their own reasons and hopes for the future.
So the revolution wasn't just this simple fight between colonists and the British.
No.
It was also this internal struggle for freedom within the colonies themselves.
Exactly. It highlights that central contradiction at the heart of America's founding.
Right.
How could a nation declare its independence on the principle of liberty?
Yeah.
While denying liberty to an entire race of people?
It's a question we're still wrestling with today, but going back to the timeline.
Sure.
Davis mentions that Thomas Jefferson actually included an anti-slavery passage.
He did.
In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, Jefferson, who was a slave owner himself.
Right.
He condemned the slave trade. In that early draft, called it a cruel war against human nature.
Wow. But it didn't make it into the final version?
Unfortunately, no.
What happened?
Well, during the debates before the signing, Southern delegates objected to it.
Oh, right.
Their economies were heavily reliant on slavery.
Makes sense.
And they refused to sign the Declaration if it condemned the slave trade.
So the document that declared America's freedom also compromised on the freedom of enslaved people?
It was a political compromise, but one with huge consequences.
Yeah.
By taking out that passage, the Founding Fathers basically embedded slavery into the nation's foundation.
A stark reminder that politics often trumps morals, but what happened to those enslaved people who fought for the colonists?
Right.
Did they get their freedom?
Some did, but many didn't.
Oh.
It's a complicated legacy full of both hope and disappointment.
Yeah.
Some were granted freedom for their service. Others were returned to their enslavers.
It's just tragic to think that after fighting for their country's independence, they were still denied their own.
It's a reminder that the fight for racial justice in America has been a long and difficult journey.
Definitely.
Full of setbacks and betrayals.
So much to unpack here. We've covered a lot, from the arrival of the first Africans to the shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, the economic factors behind the slave trade,
Right.
the early voices against it, and the complicated role of slavery in the American Revolution.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. What's the most important thing for people to understand about this period?
I think the key takeaway is that slavery in America was constantly changing,
Okay.
shaped by economics, political deals, and moral debates.
Right.
And it's easy to focus on the horrors of it.
Of course.
But it's also crucial to remember the resilience and strength of those who lived through it.
Yeah, they weren't just passive victims in all of this.
Exactly. They resisted, they fought for freedom, and left their mark on this era.
Their stories are so important.
They are. And by understanding this history, we can better appreciate the fight for racial justice that continues today.
This has been eye-opening and challenging.
It has.
Forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our past.
For sure.
And to really think about how it still affects us.
It's not easy, but it's necessary.
Absolutely.
Yep.
But even in this dark chapter of American history, there are these glimmers of hope.
There are.
Stories of resistance and strength that show us the human spirit's ability to overcome even the worst circumstances.
Right. And by learning from the past, we can work toward a more just and equal future.
So, as we wrap up this exploration of early American slavery,
Right.
what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with?
I want them to remember that this history isn't just something that happened long ago.
Right.
It's a living legacy that's still shaping our present. The choices made back then, the compromises, the injustices, they all have consequences that we're still dealing with today.
And understanding those consequences is essential to understanding race and equality in America.
I agree. This deep dive is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
It is.
So much more to learn. And by engaging with this history, we can all help build a more informed and just future. It was a calculated move, to be sure.
Yeah.
Dunmore knew offering freedom would weaken the colonists.
Right.
And it might even tip the scales, in Britain's favor.
It's kind of a ruthless tactic.
It was, but it worked. I mean, for enslaved people, it's like a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I can imagine.
A chance to escape the nightmare they were living in.
It must have been so hard for them to choose a side, though.
Oh, absolutely.
On the one hand, you have the British offering freedom.
Right.
But they're also a foreign power.
Exactly.
Then you have the colonists fighting for their own freedom.
Yeah.
But they still see you as property.
It's a real moral dilemma.
For sure. And Davis mentions that Black people actually fought on both sides.
They did.
Wow.
Each with their own reasons and hopes.
It just adds another layer of complexity to the revolution.
It does. It shows that it wasn't just about colonists versus the British.
Right.
It was also about this internal struggle for freedom within the colonies themselves.
Exactly. And it exposes that hypocrisy at America's founding.
Yeah.
How could a nation be founded on the principle of liberty,
right,
while simultaneously denying it to an entire race of people?
That's the question that's haunted America ever since its beginning.
And one we're still grappling with today, but Davis also points out something interesting.
What's that?
Thomas Jefferson included an anti-slavery passage.
He did.
In his first draft of the Declaration of Independence.
It's true. Jefferson, a slaveholder himself, actually condemned the slave trade.
Really?
Yeah, he called it a cruel war against human nature.
That's pretty powerful coming from him.
It is. It shows the internal conflict even he was facing.
But it was removed from the final version, right?
Unfortunately, yeah.
Why?
Well, Southern delegates objected to it.
I guess that makes sense.
Their economies depended on slavery.
Right.
And they flat out refused to sign the Declaration if it condemned the slave trade.
So the document that proclaimed America's freedom also ended up compromising the freedom of enslaved people.
It was a political decision with long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, for sure.
By removing that passage, they essentially enshrined slavery into the nation's foundation.
It really shows how politics can sometimes override moral principles.
It does.
But what about the enslaved people who did fight for the colonists?
Right.
Did they gain their freedom after the war?
Some did, but sadly many didn't. It's a mixed bag, really.
Oh, what?
A story of both hope and broken promises. Some were granted freedom as a reward for their service, while others were forced to return to their enslavers.
It's heartbreaking to think that they fought for their country's independence, but were still denied their own freedom.
It highlights the long and arduous fight for racial justice in America.
Yeah, a fight that continues to this day.
Exactly.
We've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have.
From those first Africans arriving to the shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. The economic factors, the early abolitionists, and slavery's role in the revolution.
It's a lot to process.
What's the one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember about this period?
That's a good question. I think it's important to understand that slavery in America wasn't static. It was constantly changing and evolving, influenced by economics, political compromises, and moral arguments.
It's easy to get caught up in the horrors of it all.
It is.
But you also have to acknowledge the incredible strength and resilience of those who endured it.
Absolutely. They weren't passive victims in this story.
Well, they fought back.
They resisted, they fought for their freedom, and left a lasting impact on this era.
And their stories deserve to be told.
They do, and by understanding this history, we can better appreciate the ongoing fight for racial justice in America.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has.
And honestly pretty challenging. It's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our past.
It's never easy to face those dark parts of history.
But it's necessary if we want to learn and grow.
I agree. And even in this dark chapter, there are these glimmers of hope stories, of resistance and resilience that remind us of the power of the human spirit.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see how people fought back even in the face of such overwhelming oppression.
It is, and by learning from the past, we can work towards a more just and equal future.
So as we wrap up this part of our exploration, what's the most important message you want to leave our listeners with?
I want them to remember that this history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living legacy that continues to shape our present. The choices made back then.
Yeah.
The compromises, the injustices, they all have consequences that we're still dealing with today.
And that's the link to understanding the complexities of race and equality in America today.
Exactly. This deep dive is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn.
It really is just scratching the surface.
It is. But by engaging with this history,
Yeah.
we can all contribute to building a more informed and just future.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how this period still affects us today.
It does. You can see a direct connection from those early laws we talked about.
The ones that made slavery hereditary.
Yeah, those laws basically laid the foundation for the systemic inequalities we see today.
It's like that saying, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past.
Yeah, exactly. We're still living with the consequences of those decisions made centuries ago.
And it's not enough to just acknowledge the past, right? We have to understand how it shapes our present. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the first step is to keep learning.
Okay.
Don't stop with this deep dive,
Right.
There are so many resources out there, books, documentaries, museums that can give you even more insights into this period.
And it's not just about reading those dry history books, right?
No.
There are so many personal stories from enslaved people themselves that can really make this history come alive.
Absolutely. Seeking out those diverse voices and perspectives is crucial.
Yeah, it's about understanding the real lived experiences of those who are most affected by slavery.
Exactly.
It's striking me that learning about history isn't just a passive thing.
Right.
It's a call to action. How can we use this knowledge to create positive change?
Well, one way is to support organizations that are fighting for racial justice and equality.
Okay.
There are groups working on criminal justice reform, educational equity, economic empowerment.
All issues that are directly tied to the legacy of slavery.
Exactly.
And it's not just about donating money, right?
No, it's about being actively engaged.
Yeah.
Having those tough conversations about race and privilege.
Right. Confronting our own biases and really holding ourselves accountable for creating a more just society.
Well said. It's a collective effort. We all need to step up and do our part.
This deep dive has been a journey, to say the least.
It has.
We've explored the origins of American slavery, the forces that shaped it, and the moral dilemmas it raised. We've seen the incredible resilience of those who endured this system and the early signs of resistance that would eventually lead to its end.
It's a story of both immense suffering and extraordinary courage.
And while it's a dark chapter in American history, it's one we absolutely can't ignore.
We can't. And by confronting its complexities and understanding its lasting impact, we can work towards a future where the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
It's been a heavy conversation, but ultimately, I think an empowering one. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, learning is a journey, and the pursuit of justice requires constant vigilance and action.
To our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep exploring this crucial part of American history. And if you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out the full article by Kenneth C. Davis on the History Reader website. It's a great resource that will allow you to dive even deeper into this subject. Thanks for joining us on this journey.